Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the broadcast. I'm Nancy Letendre. I am the town planner in the town of Westerly. And with me on this session is Jason Martin, the preservation planner from the city of Providence. Jason, you want to say hello? Just say hello.
Good afternoon.
Also, Marc Tillson, the building official, town of New Shoreham. Marc.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. Now, Jason and Marc are going to mute themselves for a little while, and they'll be back on as we proceed through the presentation. Okay. Welcome to Enforcement and Demolition by Neglect attendees. Please add your questions to the Q&A tab, which is located on your desktop. It's on the right, and we'll be answering as many questions as possible at the end of the session. Please note this program is for educational purposes only. Members of public bodies, such as historic district commissions, should be reminded that they're not to discuss and/or act upon any matter which your public body has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power over. We don't want to run into Open Meetings Act concerns. Demolition by neglect and enforcement of it. This presentation is a response to your questions. Many of the historic district commissioners and practitioners have all asked these questions. Where does the authority to enforce demolition by neglect lie, and what can be accomplished through that enforcement? And as a consequence of difficulties with that enforcement, they also ask the question, what can be done to avoid demolition by neglect? Authority to municipal government comes from state legislation. 3 areas of state legislation authorize local governments to regulate demolition by neglect. The first area, which you're likely most familiar with, is this historical area zoning. A certificate of appropriateness is required in order to demolish a building that is within a National Register Historic District that is also locally designated. There's also a standard within the historical area zoning that's titled Avoiding Demolition by Neglect. And if your city or town ordinance has incorporated this particular provision, then a HTC petition is part of the process. We're going to be hearing later from Jason Martin about how the city of Providence has addressed this. The other 2 areas actually fall under the Housing Maintenance and Occupancy Code and the State Building Code. This enforcement occurs through the building official's office, or you might have a separate housing officer or code enforcement officer. And it also refers to not only avoiding residential demolition through owner neglect, but also repairs and corrective action that can be made. Marc Tillson, who's the building official in New Shoreham, will be here to answer questions and to discuss those aspects of the presentation. All of these are related to police powers. That is the protection of public health, the safety of the public, and the general welfare of the community. Historic district commissions If your community has a demolition by neglect ordinance, then you go well beyond design review guidelines in the work that you are authorized to do. Historic preservation officers are required to determine if the condition of a building meets a certain threshold of deterioration required for demolition. In other words, the preservationists and the Historic District Commission are the ones that determine when demolition it becomes an option. The capacity and the ability to observe and document evidence of inadequate maintenance in individual buildings and monitoring conditions also falls to the preservation officer and volunteers such as the HCC. So the question comes down to whether or not municipal enforcement is strong enough to dissuade developers and property owners from using neglect or fragile conditions as a demolition tool. Now, there may be a variety of alternatives available. However, there is no one placebo. Now, this nationally recognized endangered property, the Industrial Trust Building, I believe is a good example of the type of questions that we need to be asking ourselves regarding the neglect and fragile conditions of historic structures. Demolition by neglect is a very difficult discussion. When should demolition be an option? And how can conditions be monitored? And what alternatives are there? Rhode Island law provides for local building inspection and housing maintenance code enforcement as a public safety hazard. Also, enforcement of court-imposed fines, mechanical or tax liens, and also provides for court determination and appointment of a receiver to protect public interest in abandoned property. Saving the industrial trust building, may require superhuman effort, but a determined grassroots community organization and political support can accomplish really big and complex problems. The community can use planning tools to go beyond the enforcement tools and create opportunities for redevelopment, move or alter structures that might be subject to sea level rise and storm surge or inappropriate redevelopment, or as a condition attached to some tax incentives. Not just the Superman building, but all structures of importance to a community need to remain vital. Alternatives to demolition by neglect include sale of the structure and the site itself, sale of the structure and moving it off the site, develop standards for maintenance of properties within historic districts. The State Rehabilitation Code, Chapter 9 for historical buildings is a alternative to the standard state building code. And there's other alternatives as well. Perhaps other alternatives come to mind for our viewers and listeners. If you'd like, please feel free to add them to the chat. Demolition by neglect is a community issue. Avoiding demolition by neglect of all community assets needs to be prioritized to avoid reduction in assessed value of real estate, reduction in investment in neighborhood, legal fees, loss of livable and affordable rental opportunities, residential opportunities, adverse effects on business and the economy. These are all costs to the community that go beyond the loss of historical resources. How often do we talk about demolition by neglect? Not much, maybe on occasions such as this, but we're always become interested when we hear about an endangered building like the industrial bank. Can we get the community engaged in preserving and protecting our built environment? Do you have opportunities to discuss development by neglect? What are the biggest challenges of avoiding demolition by neglect? Who should be accountable? Are there other stakeholders out there that are concerned? Ask yourself these questions. And also, feel free to add your thoughts on these questions to the chat. While you may continue to ask questions and comment, I'm going to now introduce Jason Martin, Preservation Planner from the City of Providence, to describe the city's approach to demolition by neglect using a couple of examples. Jason, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. So with the City of Providence, as Nancy mentioned, Providence is incorporated into its ordinance responsibilities of the HTC for demolition. And I don't know, Nancy, if we have that slide that has the text on it that they could see while I'm talking about those, maybe. But with that, what that does is we have, the commission obviously has a section on alternatives to demolition. But what's really the meat, I think, of what we're talking about now is avoiding demolition through owner neglect. And so in the City of Providence's ordinance, the way this works is that the city council or its designee, which is an important aspect of that, in consultation with the HTC, can identify structures of historical or architectural value whose deteriorated physical condition endangers the preservation of such structures. The council or its designee, and I'll go back why that's important, can then in the end cause the required repairs to be made at the expense of the city and a lien to be placed against the property for repayment. And the HDC will do that. Now, this is kind of a common language for demo by neglect, and other communities have incorporated into it. And the reality of this is that when you put a process like this into a political body such as a city council, it becomes political. So what Providence is starting to look at now, and I guess to kind of put an exclamation point on that, Providence has never enacted, the city council has never enacted this act in any way. It's kind of seen as just politically unfeasible. So what we've been talking about lately is, in Providence's case, we have a redevelopment agency that's also run out of the planning department. And since it can be the city council or its designee, what we're now starting to move forward with is that the redevelopment agency would be the city council's designee. This does a number of things. The redevelopment agency is a body that at times is working with abandoned properties that come into the city's hands that we then put back into private hands eventually, but they have funds available for them to actually do repairs, place the lien on the property, and be able to kind of do that. Now the process, it's not like we identify a building and the PRA shows up and boards it up. There's obviously a process to everything. There has to be a hearing. There is obviously trying to make a solution with the owner that satisfies everyone. And this would kind of be the issue, the action of last resort at that point. Another interesting thing we have in the city, which may be helpful to other communities and their building officials, is that, as Marc will, I'm sure, tell us, the building official in the end has authority over what happens to a property. He's the final authority, and he has a legal responsibility as well. And so in Providence, what we've done into our ordinance is also create a section that's called emergency demolition. And Nancy, if you want to go back to the pictures, that's where that could be helpful now. What this does, this goes back, and Federal Street's an interesting property because this is not in a historic district. This is just an old building that got demolished, and people really were upset about it, but there was no real way without some sort of public funds involved with the demolition to stop this. So this is kind of just a loss at that point. But the next property we have, Nancy, the next one we have on Westminster Street. So here's 1107 Westminster Street. This is a building that had been vacant and fire damaged for a very long time. And eventually, just recently over the early spring, this building collapsed on itself in a partial manner. And so what happened in that point is that obviously the building official went out and there was discussion about what should happen next. Because of the emergency demolition ordinance, which was originally created under what was called the mayor's, it was an ad hoc committee for historic preservation. And this is kind of what happened was out of that conversation, which happened over a decade ago now at the city, we established that when an act of God happens, a building collapses, there's a fire, what have you, and the building official is called to that property and it's historic. It's either in a local historic district or located in the city's downtown area. What happens is the building official can then call upon this subcommittee that consists of the director of the Department of Planning and of Inspection and Standards, so the building official, the fire marshal, the planning director, a structural engineer, which can be hired under the city's auspices, and the chair of the HDC or their designee. So when, for instance, when this property happened, what happened was we had a meeting on site that had representatives of that committee available, and we talked about it. And in the end, it was decided that the building was in such a shape that it could not be saved. And the building official kind of had the backing of that committee to then make the decision and not kind of, in the end, maybe be blamed for something that he just tore down because he thought it needed to come down and it hadn't been. So it gives an additional layer of process. There have been other properties we've looked at that within consultation with the official, we've said, okay, that needs to stay for a while and we'll try to, it's bad, but there is a way to fix it. So these are various tools that are available to different municipalities depending on how you want to structure them to help with this. I think, Nancy, I could stop there at this point.
Very good, thank you. Marc, would you like to add anything and discuss the...
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, the first thing, good afternoon again. The first thing I'd like to just let everyone know is I have retired from my position as the building official for the town of New Shoreham. I just want to have that on the record. I am not being paid by the town. I'm doing this as a volunteer effort. But I agree with Jason. A lot of times building officials are put in a position where you have to make that discretionary decision. Should it stay? Should it go? And it's difficult. So having, a committee and a group, a historic district commission, and the owner working together to try to save a building and or make the decision it has to come down is very helpful, very helpful. As far as my presentation, I would like to just go over what happens, as we've discussed in the past, what happens with the actual enforcement. How does that work? What is that all about? The first thing I want to let everyone know is that our building and fire safety codes mandate that buildings and structures and the parts thereof be maintained in a safe and sanitary condition by their owners. That's a period. So that puts a lot of pressure on the owner of older buildings or buildings that are getting deteriorating, that they are required by law to maintain them. If they don't, then we go into the enforcement action. I'm going to just describe or let people know what's happened in my experience on Block Island as far as dealing with enforcement actions. I'm sure that many of you probably have visited Block Island and observed when you get into the downtown area that, you know, most of the buildings are old Victorian buildings. The owners have spent a lot of time and money getting those buildings back up into really good health and safety standards. I have applauded the business owners in our community for doing that. It's taken years of effort on their part to do it. But all of the maintenance and life safety requirements that those owners have been required to do usually have to go through our local historic district and get approval. We've all heard the term certificate of appropriateness, which is approval by the Historic District Commission to go forward with whatever renovation, alteration, or new equipment installations on that building. Once the building receives his or her certificate of appropriateness, a building permit is then issued to document that approval. If, as the work commences, it is not done or not in compliance with the approved construction documents, enforcement may be necessary pursuant to the Historic District zoning and/or this Rhode Island State Building Code. Here we go, enforcement, something we all want to avoid. If the authority having jurisdiction, it was pointed out earlier, you know, somebody from a housing maintenance code, a code enforcement officer, a zoning enforcement officer, if the authority having jurisdiction, you know, finds a violation or an apparent violation, at that point in time, he or she will issue a notice to the owner and notify of them in writing of the violation. Both the Rhode Island State Building Code and the Property Maintenance Codes and our local zoning ordinance have clear procedures that must be followed in issuing that notice of violation to protect the rights of the property owner and also the actually the community. Basically, the notice of violation includes a clear description of the violation, citing the statute, the code, or the ordinance that the inspector has found to be in violation. The notice of violation is then issued, and the notice of violation has a compliance date to correct or abate the violation and or appeal the notice of violation to the appropriate Board of Appeals. And also, that stuff is also included in the notice. So you want to make sure that you're making notice of the violation, a compliance date, and then the appropriate appeal and who the appeal is made to. The same process occurs for deteriorated, neglected buildings in historic districts. In cases on the island, the violation notice, and a lot of other communities, by way of the state building code, is called a notice of unsafe conditions. It's just a different title, but it's the same thing. You're getting notice of the unsafe conditions. The building is deteriorated, maybe a fire and windstorm hazard. It may be open and unguarded, allowing children to enter. So we make sure that we get all the issues, all the notices of conditions, each item in that notice. Once that notice of violation, it's serious business. It's nothing that I ever took lightly, issuing a notice of violation to a property owner. If the corrective actions in the notice are not complied with or no appeal is filed in a timely manner, a visit to the court may be forthcoming. And once you're in the court, if the court finds or upholds the notice of violation, fines can be up to $500 per day and or imprisonment in the ACI. That's serious business. So we all try to avoid that. Some of my suggestions to avoid enforcement proceedings would be to, number one, as I stated earlier, the owner, maintain your buildings. Do the best you can to maintain them. That is your responsibility. If you fall behind in that responsibility, Contact your local building department to establish reasonable timetables to bring the neglected or deteriorated building back into compliance, or at least into basic health and safety standards. Keep the building secure, and life safety devices like your smoke detection, carbon monoxide detectors, sprinkler systems if necessary are installed. Keep that equipment in working order and have it tested. You may not be using the building, but that is so important, because if that building starts burning, spread to other buildings in the community. You can also reach out to your municipality or other organizations like Preserve Rhode Island or local groups intent on preserving historic buildings. They may be able to give guidance to help you, possibly even financially, to keep the building in a usable condition. As Nancy said earlier, which is very important, if you do begin renovating or alternating a building, there are several compliance routes that you can take. As she mentioned, the Rhode Island State Building Code has a what we call the Rehab Code, and the Rhode Island Rehab Code allows buildings that are on the Rhode Island Register or National Registry of Historic Places to use the Rehabilitation Building and Fire Code for existing buildings. This code encourages the continued use or reuse of existing buildings without requiring the full compliance with the construction requirements found in our model codes. For example, you may have an old building that has a staircase that may not meet the exact requirements of the current code. If that staircase is solid and it's secure and it's not unsafe, the building official and the fire official may allow that staircase to remain in use. The officials may say, geez, we want to have the handrails modified or make sure your headroom is clear. But it's a way that you don't have to rip that old staircase out and bring it back to full compliance with the current edition of the building code. That code, again, is the Rhode Island Rehabilitation Building and Fire Code. It's SRC 11. And again, you want to review Chapter 9. Chapter 9 deals with historic buildings. Another path is using Chapter 34 of the Straight Building Code, SBC 1. Historic, and in that you'll find historic buildings in Section 3409. I think that's all I have, other than the fact that also don't forget your friends at Rhode Island Historic and Preservation and Heritage Commission. They're a great research for assistance and guidance. Use them. That's what they're there for. That's really all I have. If you have any questions, I'm available.
Thank you, Mark. In fact, we are going to be leading into questions now. People are, I guess, having a late early afternoon coffee or tea. We have no chatting and no Q&A going on in the queue, but now's a chance. If you do have questions, we would like to interact with you through this media. Please feel free to add it to comments to the chat or the questions, particularly to the Q&A. We can only have one microphone on at a time so that we're not popping in and out of your screen. So, but Jason and Mark are all here to answer your questions. Seeing none at the moment, why don't we continue on with a few examples? I found this to be very interesting. This was kind of with the condition of the Lafayette nursing home once it closed. This picture is taken from 2016. Was kind of on again, off again. It actually, I believe it is a historic building that has like a 1960s or later facade of brick on the front of it. But it went up to public auction, and I don't know if there's anyone here that knows the history behind it, or where it ended up as of today. But this is one of those typical situations where it is important to keep an eye on things in a neighborhood and find good reuse for different properties. Let's see, we have one question. Glenn Modica. Let's say a porch on a historic building is deteriorated and a notice of violation is issued. The owner could simply remove the porch and the violation would be corrected. How do you balance that and get an owner to not only fix the porch, but rehab it to HDC standards? Jason or Mark?
Nancy, I think there's some synchronicity to this because I was just dealing with almost this exact situation about a half an hour before I got on the meeting today. So I guess, Glenn, the big thing is that if a violation is issued and the building is in a local historic district, they then need a certificate of appropriateness for the work to be approved. So that's how you kind of would approach it when it's in the Historic District Commission. But for instance, I can, here's really the situation I was dealing with earlier, whereas an owner had rehab most of the building. This owner had also called me at one point and asked if they could remove a side porch, to which I told them that wasn't going to be possible. The commission will want you to keep it. And they rehabbed the whole, worked on the building, a lot of repairs, and didn't touch that porch. That porch is now starting to collapse. So I've now told the building department, asked them to send out an inspector so that they can inspect it, issue what they feel appropriate as a notice of violation. For then that owner to correct that violation, he's going to need the certificate from us, and we will require him to do the work so that it obviously keeps the historic character of the porch.
Thank you, Jason. Looks like we have two more questions. Very good. The next one comes from Megan Dupree. Hello, Megan. With the Superman building or similarly large structures, is it reasonable to think that the owner should be asked to sell the property, or more to the point, sell the structure, have it removed from the property? Well, personally, I don't think the Superman building needs to move or ever will. So yes, I don't believe it's reasonable. But Jay?
So in a case like this, what most HDCs, what their guidelines call for demolition, is that if you're applying to an HDC for demolition of a property, you're not real. I mean, again, demo by neglect is a different thing. So if we're talking about someone who wants to demolish a property, you've got to then apply to the HDC. There are standards. So the first thing is the commission, in all cases, decides whether or not that structure is a valuable structure, and that causes a process as well. After that, there's a litany of things that, as part of the application, the applicant would have to submit. And part of those things is attempts to sell the building, other things they've tried to do before the demolition could be considered. So someone might want to demolish a building, but they have not tried to sell the building, and the commission could, in essence, say, well, you haven't met the criteria, you have to go and do that. And there's actually written criteria for how long it has to be advertised, et cetera, and so forth. So that's one way around that, I believe.
Thank you. Okay, we have some things in the chat as well. Arlene Tooney asks if a developer wants to demolish an historic building, what is the process? Well, I think we've highlighted some of that process. They do. If it's in a historic district, they do have to petition the Historic District Commission for that. Julia Blakely has a question. Could someone please address possible additional financial incentives? Does anyone know of private funding sources in the state? It's a very good question, because certainly purchasing property and actually putting some public funds into it is one good way of keeping it vital for an extended period of time. Anyone like to take that question?
I mean, quickly, there are various, it all depends on the situation. There's obviously funds available or could be made available if it's more of a public project. So if you've got an old community type building that is now going to be used by a community resource, there are community development block grant funds that could potentially be used for a project like that. We do that quite a bit in Providence. Besides that, most of the other, people have applied to things like the Rhode Island Foundation and other grants that are available out there. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of additional funding right now available through many sources to assist in this way.
Thank you. Arnold Robinson joined us with a question. He's wondering if there's any communities that have a demo by neglect ordinance, but has had issues with it, what is that due to? Is it because of lack of political will, or is it lack of leadership? Is it lack of resources? Anyone have any background in that?
So again, yeah, we kind of hit on that a little bit, Arnold, but generally, it's all of those things. It's lack of political will, it's lack of resources, it's lack of a bunch of things. And so again, it's created as a political process when you give a town council or a city council this ability. I think the key thing with that is it allows them to create a designee. So in most cases, in Providence case, there might be a redevelopment agency, or you might have an economic development kind of agency, some sort of thing. It could even be a nonprofit. It could be somebody else. But again, that agency would have to also have the wherewithal to actually make changes. Once those changes are made, we're talking about placing liens on properties to get the money back, all those kinds of things. So it's not an easy thing to kind of enact.
Thank you.
Nancy, there was also a question from Jeff Emity. I don't know if we answered that.
I apologize.
Okay.
The questions are coming in two different locations, and I'm toggling back and forth.
I've got it here. I'll say it. So Jeff wants to know, if an owner refuses to pay the fines imposed by the town, what happens next? Do accumulated fines travel with the deed if the person sells the property? And so I'm going to let Marc talk to that one too. I'm sure he's got some, but in Providence, in most cases, what happens is when we issue a violation, the fines are there. It's a lien on the property. Unless there's a cash sale, it's almost impossible for a transaction to happen. Marc, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
That's correct. The notice of violation encumbers the property. Again, under the state building code, we can also assess the costs right to the property. So that would come out of, it could go up for tax sale if they didn't reimburse the community or any monies expended boarding or removing the building or improvements to the building.
Very good. There's another question from Arlene Tooney. What are the parameters for the HDC to approve or disapprove the demolition of a building? Well, again, harkening back to the historic district zoning, unless you have specific design guidelines or standards, you'll be looking at it from the same design reviews perspective that you would for an addition or other work within the historic district on a historic structure. I put up Brown Street here in Wickford because they experienced a while back some concern because of a sewer installation that was anticipated for Brown Street through the historic district and what that might bring in terms of new uses. But the town responded with some very specific historic district design guidelines to ensure that the area and the character of the area stayed intact. if you have those in place, then you are you probably have the tools in order to review that. Jason?
Right. So I think that's a good point, Nancy. And so Providence, obviously, we have a section within the standards and guidelines that's related purely to demolition. And I pulled it up real quick. And I'll hit a couple of quick things to just kind of tell you the amount of things that are required before a demolition application even goes forward. So, from our point of view, demolition is a case-by-case basis. The applicant has to have make a good faith effort to demonstrate that all alternatives to demolition have been evaluated. This includes rehabilitation, sale, adaptive reuse, and relocation of the structure, provide both architectural and financial data to support a conclusion that demolition is the only feasible solution. So there's all that kind of documentation that needs to be made to us. And if that information is not given to the commission to where it's satisfactory, they can then request and continue that application to get that. Besides that, there are deadlines. There's a longer deadline period. There's like a 30-day deadline period for applications. In Providence, there's an ordinance that requires all demo applications be notified in the local paper. And then it gets into the procedure. So you've gotten to the board now. You've got a demolition application. What happens is, first of all, they decide whether or not the building is architecturally and historically significant. If they make that determination, the item is immediately tabled for 30 days to the next meeting. So it kind of builds in a delay there as well. They can determine a building is secondary or non-contributing, and they can hear the application at that point. And honestly, in Providence, that's the majority of the applications we hear. They might be for, say, a garage that is from the 20s or something like that. But so then, and then all of this procedure happens. And again, there is a client, historic district commissions have to remember there's a clock ticking when you are reviewing something. However, you have the ability to stop that clock in pretty much two ways. One is with the consent of the applicant, and the other is, and this is important, is that the commission finds that there is materials that have not submitted to their satisfaction to meet the application requirements, and the clock stops at that point.
Roughly 3 minutes left, a little less. We have one more question, actually 2 more questions in the chat. Let's get to one from Pierre Morenon, excuse me, the name. How do outliers like barns, garages, sheds, which contribute historically to a property or district, be protected through the historic district zoning? Anybody want to take a stab at that one? Well, I'll try.
It's appurtenances, so those structures were in a lot of places be considered appurtenances. Appurtenances are controlled by historic district guidelines. So then it's all about determining whether or not that appurtenance is considered significant or contributing, as opposed to secondary or non-contributing. And that would kind of guide which way you would go with reviewing it at that point.
That's true. Some of the older historic district nominations have identified barns and things of that nature as being historically significant, particularly if there's a number or cluster of farm buildings and there's some significance to that and its historic use. So that would be pretty evident. But as time goes on, as we know, there more and more things become significant. So I think we have time for one more question and a quick answer from Paul. What guidelines exist, if at all, for the protection of significant trees on private properties? I like that question.
So Providence has a historic tree ordinance. There's a long history I won't get into of how it happened, but Providence has a historic tree ordinance. So in essence, what happens is if a tree, the parameters, if you can't wrap your arms around the tree, it's there's more definitive, but that's kind of the guide. Any tree, regardless of where it is, private, has to then, of that size, has to be reviewed by the city forester, and the city forester has to okay removal of that. Providence also has a tree canopy ordinance for properties. And so, for instance, you might remove a large tree, but you have to plant new trees to have the required canopy by ordinance.
Well, that's great. Well, this is a good place to stop. I think we all see that there's a lot of other opportunities and a lot more for us to talk about. We've just introduced historic landscape architecture. We could go on and on about that. But our time is through. The next session is going to be either you join the HTC group for a discussion, a roundtable discussion, or you can join me and other members of local government at the other breakout session. And with that, we thank you very much for attending this panel today, and we wish everyone well, and hopefully we'll be back together in person within the year. Thank you.
Thank you.